Welcome. This presentation is for the UNC Health Care Eastowne property transportation impact analysis. The specific presentation materials contained here relate to the existing conditions analysis, the first part of the overall traffic impact analysis study. I am Craig Scheffler with HNTB, the consultant hired by the town of Chapel Hill to conduct the study. This presentation was originally scheduled to be presented at a public meeting on March 12, 2020, and is now going to be disseminated online. Today's presentation will include the following general material presented on this slide. We will go through a project background at this point, highlight the existing transportation network near the UNC Health Care Eastowne site, and then the broader project study area. We'll also highlight the processes that were completed regarding data collection, and then the general model analysis process that we will be using to analyze impacts of the future UNC Health Care Eastowne site. We will also provide operational and safety results from the existing conditions analysis, and then continue with a discussion of the next steps in the project, future year assumptions, and the analysis that will be done then. This slide highlights an overall project flowchart for the transportation impact analysis. The process began in August of 2019 with the consultant selection by the town, and we went through a series of meetings in September, October, and November to frame the scope of the project and gather input from the council committee, have a public input meeting, and then to refine the scope based on additional staff meetings into November. Our current task right now that will be highlighted in tonight's presentation is the data collection and existing conditions analysis from the overall scope. And so that occurred in December of 2019 all the way up to the present time. And it resulted in the production of a draft technical memorandum, which is available on the town's website, and highlighted in yellow on this slide, the public meeting of which this presentation will contain all the information that would have been presented at that. Our future tasks in orange would be our future year analyses of no build and build conditions, and then any mitigation scenarios to correct mobility issues caused by the UNC Health Care site, both in the short term and long term. And that will be determined over the course of the current year with additional technical memorandums presenting the results in public meetings. This slide shows an overview in general of the UNC Health Care Eastowne property site location. In a light blue color overlay, you see the phase 1 location of the current medical office building that is under construction. And the green areas show the potential development area for the master plan and subsequent phases of the expansion of the property. The property is located at the interchange of I-40 and US 15501 and would have access to the transportation system primarily off of Easttown Drive, which has 2 signalized intersections along US 15501 at locations 6 and 7 shown on the schematic diagram. The property is within the Easttown Office Park and is bordered by the Sekou and future Wegmans facilities to the south and west of the site. This slide shows, as part of the project background, the specific area of the UNC Healthcare Medical Office Building. A phase 1 traffic impact study was done in 2018 to account for the impacts of the new building location and parking deck that front Easttown Drive for its intersection with US 15501 to the south and west of the overall site. Recommendations from that study were made, and currently, as part of the construction process, the transportation improvements recommended will be included with that. One of the important features of this transportation impact analysis for the Easttown property was the expansion of the study area that was initially done for the medical office building to include more intersections and areas of town to assess impacts on mobility along the 15501 corridor into Durham all the way up to Garrett Road, and then down the 15501 corridor to the south all the way to Manning Drive to assess some of the impacts of potential traffic flow changes that may occur by changing existing development and land uses on the UNC main campus and activities that may be moved to the Easttown site by UNC Healthcare. So the total number of intersections is over 30 that are being studied and are highlighted in red on this figure, as well as the green and blue locations of the UNC Healthcare Easttown properties. The TIA for the UNC Healthcare Easttown property will also include, as part of the project background, conformance to existing traffic studies and plans, transportation plans that have been made by both NCDOT, the town, the City of Durham, the Metropolitan Planning Organization, and other local development or redevelopment projects. So as part of the study process, data was collected for each of these studies that are listed on this slide. Also important to the study, information was collected not only for traffic studies, but mobility, connectivity plans, transit planning, to make sure that all modes of transportation, whether they be pedestrian, bicycle, or transit, were covered in the study. So now we transition to a description of the existing transportation network that was analyzed as part of the study. And this slide shows the general location of elements of the network. What we have on the slide is in black was the network that was originally created and analyzed as part of the Ephesus Fordham or Blue Hill District transportation impact analysis, and specific modeling was created for that study. This study will build upon that modeling and add areas to the north and east in red, including the I-40 corridor, to that original study area, and make some modifications for several roads in the original study area, with the ultimate intent of continuing to expand this transportation model to eventually become a town-wide analysis tool that will be used for all sections of Chapel Hill. As part of an evaluation of the existing transportation network made for the study, HNTB personnel conducted several field observations in November and December of 2019 to assess the existing transportation system and do a field check of information and plans that we had obtained as part of the data collection process. We did travel time studies with a car up and down the 15501 corridor, noting areas of congestion and relative times from point to point between segments of the network. We also noted areas where construction activity may have an impact on the transportation system that we're analyzing in the base conditions. And we incorporated these results and observations in an assessment of our traffic models to make sure that they were replicating real-world situations and congestion and traffic queues. As part of the assessment of the existing transportation network, some review and data collection was done to get an understanding in the project study area of existing conditions for pedestrians and bicycles. And so this slide highlights some schematic results that are found in the report of areas where there are either pedestrian sidewalks, crosswalks, signalized crosswalks, or bicycle facilities and greenways that connect areas throughout the study area network. And what we'll be looking for is gaps in those connections and how this particular development will be served by both pedestrians and bicycles in the future, and what improvements may be needed throughout the study area to make that happen. In addition to the pedestrian and bicycle inventories that were done for the analysis, we also took a look at the existing transit networks that are provided weekday, weekend, fixed route service that is provided by Chapel Hill Transit and Go Triangle and Go Durham. And this schematic diagram shows a listing of all the existing routes that serve the general study area around the Easttown property and locations of bus stops that are associated with each of the routes. One of the important things to also assess with this project is the potential for increasing transit capabilities to serve the site, but what needs might there be given existing routes and adjustments to existing routes that might occur to make that happen. As part of the data collection process for the existing transportation network, we also collected information on very specific details related to the roadways and their design, and that includes, as shown on this particular slide, the traffic signal plans for a particular intersection, and all of the details related to that are necessary for inclusion in the traffic models that were developed for this project. In addition to all the physical characteristics of the transportation network in the project study area, we also went through a process of collecting traffic volume data, turning movement counts, 48-hour tube counts, to gather information about traffic flow characteristics in the AM, noon, and PM peak periods of a given weekday. We had existing information throughout the 2019 year from previous traffic studies that was incorporated, and then we supplemented that with additional turning movement counts at various locations around the study area. All the counts that we did were not just for vehicles, they also included pedestrians and bicycles, because we can include those characteristics as well as truck percentages and buses in our more detailed traffic models, and so this step was an important piece in that. As was discussed previously, part of the data collection process also included a review and accumulation of plans from local, regional, and NCDOT sources, including development plans and previous traffic studies that have been done recently for projects in the project study area for the Eastowne development. We also took a look at collecting transit ridership data from the local transit agencies, collected traffic signal plans and timing data, collected the last 5 years worth of crash data for the 15501 corridor and Easttown Drive loop to get an assessment of crash patterns in the immediate vicinity of the site. We also went to the Metropolitan Planning Organization and obtained the latest copy of the Regional Travel Demand Model, which we'll touch on in following sections as far as its use in the project study. Transitioning to the model analysis process itself, we'd like to take a second to discuss some of the various transportation models used in this study to do the evaluation of existing conditions. There are basically two types of models that we will focus on in the study. One, we have the big picture model, which takes regional information and a simplified view of the network and the way that traffic is assigned to the network and flows through the network, and that's in the upper left-hand corner of the slide. And then we have the more detailed model, which is our micro-simulation model that shows individual vehicles on actual roadways and is done to a much higher level of detail. And so the key to success in this study is to have both models work together and provide useful information to evaluate impacts both at a regional big picture level and then at a smaller, more detailed intersection level. A description of the models used includes the microsimulation model is called TransModeler, and it's a software tool that can model both the transit networks, pedestrian networks, traffic networks, and it's something that is currently used quite a bit by NCDOT and the town of Chapel Hill, and was used exclusively in the Blue Hill District TIA successfully to model those impacts, and was expanded upon and approved upon for this particular Easttown study. A couple important points about the model also is that the TransModeler tool integrates with the triangle regional model, and that's the big picture model that I showed on the previous slide, and that both models are going to be used to be revised in future scenarios for the effects of development projects around both the specific project study area and Easttown site, but as well as regionally in terms of updating what is currently has been modeled previously to account for the effects of ongoing development in the area. So here we have a graphic of the triangle region, and you can see Raleigh and Durham shown, and a skeleton map of the network roadway lengths that are included in the regional model. And this is known as TRM version 6. And so from this really big picture, high-level shot, we will narrow down on the area more closely related to Chapel Hill and the Easttown project. Here we see a more zoomed in detail of that regional model with an underlying layer of local streets and roads in black and the regional model links in red. And one of the activities that is underway with this project and will continue to be done in the future scenario analysis is to both validate and check the existing network in the regional model so that it matches the characteristics that are actually found on existing roadways. In addition to that, it will be refined to reflect any changes in the future that are planned for the larger study area roadways. Now, the regional model's intent is not to analyze every single local subdivision street, but is used as a tool to assess traffic growth in the study area that is caused by larger, more regionally oriented developments like the Eastowne project. One of the other features of the Triangle Regional Model is the fact that it uses information about households, businesses, business employment, and other socioeconomic characteristics to produce trips to and from different zones or traffic analysis zones or areas of each part of Chapel Hill and Durham and the surrounding communities. And so on this slide we see a schematic showing those polygons, and they have numbered identifications of each of them and where they are relative to the Eastowne site in yellow. And again, as part of this process, we will be going in to these traffic analysis zones and their population and employment data and making updates as we need to reflect proposed development plans that may change the integrity of these traffic analysis zones from what was assumed in the base models of the Triangle Regional Model. Here we see a listing of the TransModeler model and the basic elements that go into it, and some of these have already been discussed in the data collection process. And so the model takes information from all of these categories to produce a simulation of vehicles and pedestrians and traffic signal changes that are meant to reflect real conditions that are experienced in the AM, noon, and PM peak periods that we are analyzing. Going a little bit deeper into the TransModeler Details, this is just an example of how traffic volume data is input into the model, where an actual intersection after the roadway links are drawn on top of an aerial diagram to represent the realistic way an intersection looks in terms of turn lanes and storage bays and things like that. Traffic volume information that we obtained from the traffic counts that were done is entered for each movement at the intersection. From these traffic data, the model will use this to create origin-destination matrices of traffic flows throughout the entire network. Similarly, traffic signal information is entered into the model as well for each particular signalized intersection. And this shows a schematic of the input screen within TransModeler, where details in terms of how many seconds a left turn arrow comes up is entered for each peak hour in the analysis. And so again, we're getting into very fine details in our existing conditions model to try to mimic it the best we can, realistic conditions that then can be adjusted in the future. As well as the traffic volume data and traffic signal data that is entered at an intersection, intersections that feature pedestrian crossings with signalized crosswalks, as well as unsignalized crosswalks, if those are the case, were also put into the model. And we can take our pedestrian count information and enter that into the model at these locations, at which point the model will create a crosswalk in that area, and during the model run will emulate the effects of pedestrians crossing a particular location and the impacts that that would have on turning traffic that must yield to them. Separate from the TransModeler microsimulation model analysis process, we also have included a transit load and capacity model process to this study. And this has been done successfully for previous studies in Chapel Hill, where transit usage is high along a corridor or is important to support a development plan. We take the ridership data that we get for routes that Chapel Hill Transit or Goat Triangle provide, nearest site, and we take an analysis that includes the transit ridership, boardings and alightings for a vehicular peak hour in the morning, noontime, and PM. And we look at each bus stop and assess that data and accumulate that data and compare that to the typical capacity provided by a bus. In the case for the UNC Health Care Eastowne property, the local area is serviced by two Chapel Hill Transit routes, the D route in green on the slide and the CL route in a pink color that provides nearby service and has nearby bus stops. In addition, Go Triangle provides regional service between Chapel Hill and Durham on the 400 and 405 routes, which run along the 15501 corridor and are shown in red and orange on the figure. And getting back to the transit load and capacity analysis, we will take information from these routes and bus stops and include those for all four. Continuing the discussion of the model analysis process for this project, we'd like to turn to the multimodal comparative model art plan that we are using to evaluate levels of service differences between the four transportation modes that are being studied, that being traffic, transit, pedestrian, and bicycle. And this software tool allows input for all the four modes and assesses them equally in the sense that trade-offs made to favor one mode in comparison to another will be reflected by the composite scores and level of service being reported. This software tool evaluates these transportation modes by segment or block in a particular direction along a corridor and by the peak hour that's being studied. And vehicle characteristics in the traffic mode do have effects on the other modes, so a change in traffic levels caused by a shift in traffic or speed of traffic may improve the levels of service reported for the other modes. Related to pedestrian level of service from the Art Plan software tool, there are several inputs that go into calculating that level of service, and they include the following as shown on this slide. Primarily, both pedestrian and bicycle level of service is really not a function of capacity of the sidewalk or bike lane. It is more of a function of whether it's provided or not, and what condition that facility is in. And so these sort of inputs take account for things of that nature. The bicycle level service determination uses some similar inputs as the pedestrian level of service, but more related to bicycles and whether or not there is a bike lane or a side path present along the corridor, what kind of condition that's in, how wide is the outside travel lane that would be adjacent to or used by the bicycle facility. So again, these are some quantitative things that we can input into the software tool that will produce levels of service for segments to assess bicycle functions. The final elements of the multimodal comparative models that we need to discuss are related to transit and vehicular levels of service and how they're calculated. Unlike the transit demand and capacity analysis that I discussed previously, the transit level of service for corridors that are studied in this project use some more general characteristics such as bus frequency, passenger load factor, and whether or not there are bus stops along a particular segment and what condition those stops are in. That all adds up to the calculation of the transit level of service as part of our analysis. The vehicular level of service are also calculated by the software tool, and they are a combination of general traffic and signal operations characteristics that are some of the same inputs but on a much broader scale than what we're putting into the traffic micro simulation models that I've also shown previously. Turning our attention in the model analysis process to the traffic simulation models and the information we can get out of them, we also can pull network information that would account for all the trips and activity in the network that's modeled in the orange circle. We also can extract information specific to vehicles traveling along a certain corridor, like the 15501 corridor shown in pink. And we can also extrapolate information from the model that would concern the individual intersections throughout the project study area, both signalized and unsignalized, as shown in the black arrow. This slide shows the system performance measures of effectiveness, or MOEs, for the entire study area network shown in the graphic, which includes both the main corridors, that small portion of freeway on I-40, and some of the local streets around the Easttown site and in nearby arterials and side streets up and down the 15501 corridor. And so collectively, when all of that information is added together, the number of trips completed, vehicle miles traveled, vehicle hours traveled, some of the statistics that aggregate all the information and provide a comparison between the peak hours and then between future scenarios have been compiled in Table 11 that is below the graphic. Related to the 2019 existing conditions results for the US 15501 corridor, we broke the corridor up into 4 approximately equal length segments that also have approximately uniform traffic cross sections and kind of have similar feels within the corridor as far as the driving experience goes. And so after dividing them up and aggregating the results from the simulation model runs, we have on this slide shown corridor speeds for each of the segments, the average speed of vehicles between the endpoints of the corridor. And so as you can see from the data, there is some variation between the peak hours and by direction in certain circumstances where there is a more congestion experience in a particular direction for a particular peak hour. Though the results do not at this point indicate any significant impediments to traffic flow, we obviously realize that there are some individual areas of congestion that contribute to these results. Again, the results will be used as a baseline for future comparisons to no build and build scenarios to assess the amount of mobility degradation that may occur along various portions of the 15501 network. Now shifting our attention to intersection performance measures of effectiveness. This chart shows level of service characteristics for vehicles at signalized intersections and at stop signs, and the calculation of level of service between A and F, A being free flow, very few vehicle, uncongested conditions, and level of service F being complete breakdown and spillback and gridlock conditions on a network. What the relative breakpoints are for the amount of control delay in each situation. Thereby, a level service C, for example, would correspond to between 20 and 35 seconds of average delay for a vehicle at any approach at a given intersection if it's signalized. Whereas it's only 15 to 25 seconds, a little bit lower than the signalized delay for vehicles delayed by a stop sign. And this is because the perception of delay that drivers expect at a stop-controlled intersection is less than what their expectation is as a signalized intersection. When we get over 55 seconds of delay, the level of service D threshold, at a signalized intersection, what we also find is that because there is so much delay in traffic backing up, that vehicles are often unable to be cleared through this intersection in one signal phase. So the lengthy delay and poor performance go hand in hand in terms of determining the effectiveness of intersection operations. The next several slides give a schematic view throughout the study area network of our intersection level of service results. The schematics show intersections where a signal is located or two-way stop controlled intersections are located along the corridor. The graphic on this slide pertains primarily to the southern portion of the corridor from Manning Drive up through Estes Drive and Willow Drive along the 15501 corridor. Several of the stop-controlled intersections along 15501 experienced lengthy delays because of lack of gaps during peak hour heavy travel on 15501. So the side streets have difficulties making their turn movements, contributing to these poor levels of service. Also down in the Manning Drive and Old Mason Farm vicinity, we see level of service Ds and Es for some of the peak hours where there is significant congestion in that area. In the central section of the broad project study area, the slide shown indicates levels of service at intersections along the 15501 corridor and then along East Franklin Street. Primarily, there is existing congestion in the area of the East Franklin Street intersection with Elliott Road in the PM peak hour, and then pretty consistently through all peak hours in the vicinity of Sage Road and US 15501, and then extending to the vicinity of Old Durham Road and Scarlet Drive. That area is to be improved by the Wegmans project, which is currently under construction. Specifically in the vicinity of the Easttown master plan site, there are several intersections along the 15501 corridor and then around the Easttown Drive loop that were analyzed in the microsimulation model for peak hour levels of service and are shown on this slide. The signalized intersections along 15501 operate acceptably at a level of service B and C in current existing conditions, and then the intersections that are stop controlled along the Easttown Drive loop also operate acceptably during existing conditions for the stop controlled movements. Moving on to the northern and easternmost portions of the project study area network into the city of Durham, several intersections along Old Durham Road and along the 15501 corridor up to Garrett Road were analyzed in the microsimulation analysis, and the results are showing on the current slide. Again, 15501, the corridor to the north of I-40, does experience more traffic volume than the corridor to the south into Chapel Hill, but it does also have an additional travel lane through this section. Even with that extra capacity, the intersections along the corridor are quite busy during the day, some dropping to a level of service D throughout the day, which means that there is not much additional capacity to these roadways to keep traffic flowing. And the intersections along Old Durham Road, one being a roundabout at Pope Road and the other being stop control at Lakeview Drive, operate acceptably in existing scenarios. As part of the evaluation in the microsimulation model, we also wanted to take a look at traffic queues along the corridor and see where either individual intersection congestion or just high volume traffic conditions were causing backups between intersections. And the schematic map shown here indicates areas where in at least one peak hour we have fairly significant backups from a particular intersection or segment in the network. A couple of highlights are that there is a fair amount of rolling congestion and poor operations down in the Manning Drive Old Mason Farm area in the southern part of the network. Again, we see the East Franklin Estes Drive intersection as being somewhat problematic in at least one peak hour. And then when the corridor merges with East Franklin Street, there's some friction there with two moving flows of traffic in single lanes, and then heading through the Sage Road intersection and out to the I-40 corridor. Turning our attention to the transit load and capacity analysis results for 2019, the following graphs on this slide show each transit route, and subsequent slides will show each transit route in the project study area and their ridership levels in the blue lines in the graphs, and their service load and maximum capacity levels as red dotted and red solid lines respectively on the graphs. So to read the graphs, you go from left to right from one end of the transit route to the terminus, and you can see the passenger levels rising southbound on the CL route in this particular slide in the morning. On the top graph, the Easttown area is denoted in a green box, relatively speaking to the bus stop numbers that run along the x-axis of the graph on the bottom. And so what we see is in the morning, southbound heading inbound towards downtown Chapel Hill and UNC's main campus, that the ridership does exceed both the service capacity and maximum capacity along the CL route. Heading northbound in the PM peak hour, again, we go from left to right, and you can see the ridership levels increasing to about 30 riders on each averaged CL bus during the peak hour, and then towards the Easttown area at the end of the route, ridership declining as passengers unload. Similarly, for the D route, Chapel Hill Transit D route, we have southbound AM and northbound PM load and capacity graphs shown on this slide. And again, moving left to right on the graph, heading southbound into town, the Easttown area is at the terminus of the D service, or the furthest stops away from the downtown area, and we can see ridership increase to about 31 or so riders heading inbound towards the downtown, and then riders unloading as they weave through the downtown area towards UNC hospitals on the right side of the graph. Northbound in the PM peak hour in the bottom graph on the slide, from UNC hospitals, ridership increases to service capacity in the downtown area, and then rather quickly unloads in the middle of the route, and by the time the route gets to the Easttown area, ridership is around, or bus load is around 10 passengers per bus in the average peak hour. Turning our attention to the multimodal level of service results for the software tool that uses information for all four different modes of transportation, and that would be pedestrian, bicycle, transit, and vehicular modes. The report contains several schematic images of existing levels of service for each mode, for each corridor segment that we've studied, and again, those were the 15501, East Franklin, Easttown, Sage Road, and those type corridors. And so these schematics that we're going to show in these slides, in the next following slides, indicate levels of service by color code for each of those segments. If it's level of service A to C, meaning the facility for the particular mode has good conditions, safe conditions, efficient conditions for mobility, it's a level of service A to C, which would be a green line. As we worsen to D, E, or F, the line changes color from yellow to orange to red. And so for pedestrians, on the southern portion of the network, between Estes Drive basically and heading up towards Sage Road, this is the graphic that's showing those results. And here's the following schematic showing the corridor results nearer to the Easttown site from the I-40 corridor to the south and west along Sage Road, Old Durham Road, Easttown Drive, Old Sterling Road, and the 15501 corridor. And again, this would be for the pedestrian levels of service currently experienced on these study area segments in each direction also. This slide shows the bicycle 2019 existing conditions results for corridors levels of service similar to the pedestrian graphs and schematics that we showed on the previous two slides. So this would be from the 15501 and East Franklin Street corridors. And again, by direction, generally a level service E for bicycles, meaning some difficult conditions with regards to mobility or safety along these corridors currently. And this would be the bicycle level service for the corridor segments around the Easttown site, more specifically. Again, the 15501 corridor scores poorly, level service E. And in general, the other corridors, because of dedicated bike facilities or low traffic volumes or adequate pavement width, score much better in the A to C range, with Old Durham Road and Old Chapel Hill Road currently scoring poorly, but with the DOT project to improve pedestrian and bicycle service along that corridor, level service should improve when we do the analysis for the future conditions in that location. This slide shows the transit level of service results for the corridor segments that would have been previously discussed for pedestrian and bicycle multimodal level of service. What we see with transit level service is that it's highly dependent upon bus routes being currently on a particular facility in a particular direction and with adequate numbers of bus stops and access to the bus stops along that corridor and segment. So compared to the other modes of transportation with the transit level service analysis, what we often will see is some directional differences in levels of service along a particular corridor, like we do in this graphic with the 15501 corridor and bus service provided in certain directions more robustly than others. This slide shows the transit levels of service for corridors and roadways around the Easttown site. And as was previously mentioned, transit level service is highly dependent on directional service, and this is a good indication of that, where several of these roadways in one direction where there are bus stops in a transit route going one way and making a loop around the Easttown area, such is the case with both the CL and D routes that currently serve the area. In one direction, the levels of service numbers are really good, A through C, and in the other direction where no service is provided, the evaluation would indicate a level of service F. And again, these are all just comparative and meant to identify areas where modes of transportation may need to be better served either now or in the future. And so again, all these analysis results will be used as a base point to compare future scenario changes with. The final piece of analysis that was done for the UNC Health Care Eastowne property TIA was to take an assessment of 5 years worth of recent crash data along the 15501 and Easttown Drive corridors in and around the project site, and assess whether or not the numbers of crashes and types of crashes are representative of other similar facilities around the state of North Carolina. And so for this, on this slide, we have two tables of results that are included in the report that compare 15501 and its crash rates for different types of crashes, including fatalities, injury crashes, crashes that occur at night, and crashes that occur on wet pavement, with similar facilities across the state. And as well, we did the same thing with Easttown Drive, the circular portion through the Easttown Office Park. And what we found from those results is that in general, that both facilities have higher crash rates for a number of the categories compared to similar facilities. And where those crashes are occurring was further broken out in the table at the bottom of the page at each intersection along 15501 and then at Easttown Drive. And what we find is most of these crashes that cause Easttown Drive to be above state averages are occurring at the 15501 intersections themselves, the western and eastern intersections. Along the 15501 corridor, the predominance of crashes, about 700 out of 1,100 over the 5-year period, are rear-end crashes that again are indicative of a lot of congestion and stop-and-go traffic along the facility. And the table also breaks out different crash types. And from these pieces of information, we can identify critical intersections that need to be looked at for potential safety improvements along with capacity improvements. Transitioning to the next steps for the transportation impact analysis, the bullet list on this slide shows a ordered strategy for assessing the impacts of background developments and planning committed improvement projects in the future. As part of what we will be doing is taking those pieces of information and modifying both our regional travel demand model and our traffic microsimulation models for defined time periods, whether they be short-term or long-term future analyses. We will develop future growth rates for both traffic and transit to assess impacts, and then we will look at both what we would call no-build analyses without improvements and development at the Easttown site, and then a build analysis that would include these improvements, whether they be building, parking deck, access, new roadways, those sorts of things. And so again, these will be done for both a shorter term and a longer term to assess the likelihood of immediate impacts over the next several years, but then the long-term impacts over a longer time horizon. Focusing in a little bit deeper on the background development assessment, what we have on this slide is a schematic drawing of the study area network and intersections in gray circles up and down the 15501 corridor, and then the green polygon showing the UNC Health Care site near the I-40 corridor. What we've highlighted with yellow stars are potential future planned development locations, whether they're through the formal planning process right now with the town or not. We also are including in the drawing some blue stars, which show locations of developments that are currently under construction. So again, the assessment of the impacts of both of these types of new development or redevelopment will need to be accounted for in our short and long-term analyses. Providing a few more details about the travel demand modifications that will be part of the next steps of this project. Again, we turn back to some of the schematics we showed before concerning the travel demand model network in red and how it might be adjusted to reflect the actual roadway network that may change in future years in black. So we would be doing those type of adjustments, as well as the traffic analysis zone adjustments that are shown in the blue polygons in the lower right schematic. So obviously the polygon in yellow that contains the Easttown site would definitely be subject to modification to either increase or decrease depending upon the information that's already in the model for future scenarios regarding the numbers of employment and households and things of that nature that make up the socioeconomic data. This will also be done, as we've alluded to before, for other traffic analysis zones where regional development is expected to occur beyond just the immediate project study area around the UNC Health Care site. A quick note regarding the next steps and project schedule. At this juncture, the official project schedule, which would determine target dates for different project milestones related to the analysis and traffic study, and potential town council meetings dates or public meeting dates are all still to be determined over the course of 2020 based on additional direction from project stakeholders. That concludes this presentation of the existing conditions analysis for the UNC Health Care Eastowne property transportation impact analysis study. If there are additional questions related to the presentation materials, please contact Town of Chapel Hill staff for additional transmission of those questions or comments, and they will be included as appropriate in future study materials. Thank you.